And we are live. Hey, Howie.
Hey,
Hey, Green family. Hey, Gator. I see you out there. And I'm handing it to you, Howie, because I'm brain dead right now.
well, we were going to talk tonight about Biden's, what he calls American Jobs Plan, and buried in it is his climate plan. And just to sum up what I'm going to say, it's too late for gradualism. This thing doesn't deal with the climate emergency by any means. And I'm going to spell that out. So I'm going to take, maybe 15, 20 minutes to do that. But first, if you want to share your thoughts on what's going on, why don't you go ahead?
I want to I'm exhausted, y'all. So y'all already know it's construction season and, I drive a dump truck. I do road construction and it is go time for us. So I am not at 110%. So y'all just excuse me. But I want to shout out This Is Revolution podcast for having me as a guest on Saturday. And also, and I'll have to find the link and put it in the chat. But they also did a discussion about what is happening in Brazil as far as Brazilian politics and the exoneration of Lula and, what this means for Bolsonaro's presidency. So I'll find that link and make sure that it gets posted. Folks who are watching international politics, it was an amazing discussion. It was a necessary discussion. Lots of parallels to what we're looking at in this country. Even though that individual is out of office, thankfully, there's a lot of damage to be repaired, and there are concerns that the international community has about the way that President Joe Biden is going to go about foreign policy. Especially since some of the policies that were detrimental, to other countries also happened under the Obama-Biden administration. So, what we saw with 45 was a continuation of some things foreign policy wise that had begun under Obama-Biden. So I'm going to find my link and share that with y'all. And also, just to give everyone a heads up, this is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. I meant to have on my little shirt, but like I said, I'm wore slap out, as they say in Florida. So that ain't happening. So I'm going to hand it over to the original Green New Dealer himself, and I'm going to find y'all that link, and he's going to talk to y'all about this interesting plan that this president has around the climate.
All right, thank you, Angela. So last Wednesday, Biden went out to Pittsburgh, and at 5 a.m, the White House released a 12,000-word fact sheet on what they call the American Jobs Plan. And this is the infrastructure plan we've been hearing about. Embedded in it are his climate actions. But the 1,200 words hardly even mentions the climate emergency. Just in passing, it says it'll be, good for reducing carbon without having any goals or timetables in most cases. And the climate emergency really demands a radical decarbonization on a rapid timetable. And that can only be met by an eco-socialist approach that features public enterprise and planning. The eco-socialist Green New Deal budget we put out there, we analogize to the World War II emergency, where the federal government took over a quarter of manufacturing capacity in order to turn industry on a dime into the arsenal of democracy to defeat the fascists. And what we have here in Biden's plan is corporate welfare, subsidies and market-based incentives for clean energy that will take uncertain effect at a leisurely pace. They don't have any sense of urgency. Greta Thunberg, should be scolding them like she has world leaders around the world. And the scale of how much money they're planning to spend to try to transform our economy to clean energy is pathetic. it is not serious. And I'll get into some of the details. And when I say it's too late for gradualism, let's just remember where we are. James Hansen famously set an initial target back in 2008 with his climate science colleagues that we should aim for 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, 350 ppms. And that compares to a pre-industrial level of 280 ppms. And during the Holocene, that's the period in which humanity, post-Ice Age, developed agriculture and civilization, has never got higher than 350 parts per million until the last 4 decades. So we blew through that 350 parts per million budget in 1988. So 3.5 decades ago. And in February, we averaged 416 parts per million. And on April 3rd, a few days ago, the reading at Mauna Kea Observatory in Hawaii was 421 parts per million. That's a record. The last time atmospheric carbon was this high was in the middle of the Pliocene epoch, 3.3 million years ago, when the temperature was, in Fahrenheit, 11 degrees higher, that's 6 degrees Celsius, and sea levels were 40 meters or 130 feet higher than today. That's baked into the climate system now, unless we draw this carbon out. And this rapid climate change entails more than just heat waves and extreme weather events, and as the coastal areas flooded cities, it's much more existential. And this is going to happen as we move towards the middle of the century, 2050. Mass extinctions, collapsing land and ocean ecosystems, which means collapsing agriculture and food shortages, and mass starvation, economic contraction, and increasing poverty in many respects, hundreds of millions of climate refugees. And of course, in that context, escalating social conflict and resource wars. This is really an apocalyptic scenario. Now, it may still be possible, citing James Hansen, he put out an optimistic scenario a couple years ago that if we start a rapid phase out of emissions of 6 to 10% per year and a radical transformation of our agriculture and massive reforestation, we may be able to capture enough carbon in the atmosphere to draw down carbon to below 350 parts per million by the end of this century. And then just hope that we haven't tipped off these reinforcing mechanisms that will push irreversible global warming beyond our control and into a climate catastrophe. But the problem is we're nowhere near the kind of scenario that Hansen proposed. The 2018 special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees by the International Panel on Climate Change projected that to have a 2/3 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees, the remaining carbon budget was 420 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Today, that budget is down to 280 gigatons. We're burning 42 gigatons a year, and we're going to blow through that budget by the end of 2027. And that's just to have a 2/3 chance. That's like playing Russian roulette with a 3-chamber pistol, and one of those pistols has a bullet. So the odds are not the kind of odds you want to start with. So this is an emergency. And Biden comes up with this plan that, it's outlined in 1,200 words. Congress and corporate lobbyists are going to be, pounding out something with this thing. There'll be horse trading. The policies of Biden have some good things in terms of targeting funds to disadvantaged communities and promoting union jobs. And it includes the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, the PRO Act. These are good social policies. Whether they survive this horse trading remains to be seen. They hope to have a bill that they can vote on in the summer. But instead of going into all the social policies, I'm going to focus on the climate impact of this campaign, of this plan. And as I said, the scale is pathetic. It calls for $2.25 trillion over 8 years. And for comparison's sake, the environmental movements, the big environmental groups, what's called the Green New Deal Network, that's 15 national progressive groups, unions, groups like the Sunrise Movement and the Sierra Club, progressive Democrats like Ed Markey and AOC, they have this Thrive agenda and a Thrive Act that they're going to introduce that calls for $10 trillion over 10 years. And that's more like it, but having read the literature, they almost just grab those numbers at random because they don't relate to how do you get the carbon down fast enough. They more emphasize the jobs, which is a good thing to do. Historically, the problem for the climate movement and the environmental movement is the corporate interests say we're taking jobs when that's not true. We're creating more jobs with environmental measures, including climate action. But that's what they've decided politically. They have compromised from what Bernie Sanders was offering in his Green New Deal, which was the only serious proposal that any of the Democrats put forward. It was an order of magnitude greater than any of the others. It was 16.3 trillion over 10 years. It would have created 20 million jobs. It would have got us to 100% clean power, electricity by 2030. And like we proposed in our eco-socialist Green New Deal, it would have done that mainly through the public sector, through the production and sale of power, building upon the existing power marketing administrations that come out of the New Deal, the old New Deal. And but different from us, he didn't clean up the other sectors, which is almost 3/4 of all carbon emissions, until 2050. But it was a serious proposal. And when we looked at their numbers, they didn't show their homework like we did, but they looked like they were on the mark. And then we have our plan, which is 41.7 trillion over 10 years. 27.5 trillion is for what we call the Green Economy Reconstruction Program, which is how we get to zero emissions, moving toward negative emissions, and 100% clean energy by 2030. And we choose that because the best climate scientists over the last 15 years have said that's the time frame we got to move. They were saying that like around 2010. We got to do it in a decade. Well, now we're 2021. So, we in our campaign said 100% clean energy by 2030. And so that's one part of the program. And I'll refer to it as I go through Biden's, through the different energy sectors. And then we had 14.2 trillion for an economic bill of rights. And this is something that was not diluted out of the non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal that Ed Markey and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced. Pelosi never let him vote on it. McConnell had him vote on it because he wanted the Democratic presidential candidates from the Senate to go on the record. And those Democrats voted present, except 4 of them voted no with the Republicans on a non-binding Green New Deal that was watered down. It extended the deadline we were talking about from 2030 to 2050. And you have to understand that it was the Green Party, it was our signature issue in the last decade. And, it got picked up by the Democrats and they watered it down. They eliminated the ban on fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure, which is crucial. If that infrastructure gets built, the investors expect to be making money off that for 3 or 4 decades. And we're locked into burning fossil fuels unless, we have a revolution and condemn those facilities and build clean energy in their place. They eliminated the phase out of nuclear power. They eliminated the cuts to military spending to help fund this thing. So, that was the best of what we got from the progressive Democrats, except for Bernie Sanders. And but one thing the non-binding resolution did, it referred to an economic bill of rights. So in our eco-socialist Green New Deal, we have a job guarantee, guaranteed income above poverty, Medicare for all, lifelong public education from preschool and childcare through higher education and trade schools, and a secure retirement. So that's the other part of the eco-socialist Green New Deal. And it creates 38 million jobs. Or, I'm sorry, yeah, 38 million jobs. The problem is we got a shortage of labor. That's the bottleneck in that plan. So, you compare what we're talking about to what Biden's talking about. We're talking about 10 times more. The liberals are talking about roughly 5 times more. Sanders was talking about 4 times more. We're saying 10 times more. So that'll give you an idea. And if you look at these plans that I just outlined or referred to, the plan we put forward is the only one with a budget that tells you what it's going to cost, how many jobs it will create, what it will do. And we also talk about how to pay for it. But I'm not going to get into that so much. I mean, part of Biden's plan is raising corporate taxes. I'll just say on the financing, it'll cost us more not to borrow the money and get this done now than to neglect getting it done. Because what it will do to the ecosystems and the agriculture and the whole economy that depends on our environment and those ecosystem or environmental services, that will cost a hell of a lot more than borrowing the money and building this new green economy. So let's look at the sectors. The biggest sector in terms of energy consumption is transportation, 28% of our carbon footprint. And Biden proposes $621 billion. Our Eco-Socialist Green New Budget proposes $6.8 trillion. This is over a 10-year period. The emphasis in the Biden transportation thing is roads and bridges, basically keeping the system we got going. But it does have a lot of money for electric vehicles. And actually, in this one case, the investment seems to be adequate to the need. Talks about building 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations by 2030 in 10 years. And that goal seems to be about right. Right now, we have 42,000 charging stations. The Center for American Progress estimated just to keep up with the demand. And you got to remember, companies like GE are going 100% electric vehicle. Massachusetts and California have already set deadlines. You can't buy or sell internal combustion engines in those states after 2035. So we're moving that way. Now, it's a big subsidy to the private auto industry to build their charging stations for them. But if that's what it takes to get there, that's good. And 15 years, the deadlines that California and Massachusetts set is consistent with the roughly 15-year turnover time for vehicles, for our vehicle fleet. There are 280 million vehicles. The criticism that we would have is that we want to move people out of individual vehicles into public transportation as much as possible. Because building all these vehicles and all this solar and wind capacity requires a lot of extraction of minerals and other resources from the earth. And while in our Eco-Socialist Green New Deal, we have a big investment in recycling, which isn't even mentioned in the Biden proposal, extracting materials from the earth. And if you're not recycling them, throwing them back as waste on the environment is a big problem. So it's much more energy and resource efficient to have most transportation, routine transportation, going to work, going to school, going to get your groceries in public transportation than a personal vehicle. So that would be a critique there. And then when they get to buses, and I don't quite understand how they could be so generous toward private vehicles, but stingy to the bus fleet. They say they will make sure there are 50,000. They will convert 50,000 buses to electric, and 20% of school buses. 50,000. There are about 1 million buses in this country. So, that is just not a serious proposal, particularly given that diesel exhaust is what causes the most problem in terms of particulates and, nitrogen and sulfur oxides that damage the lungs and kills people. Why that gets short shrift, I think is a criticism. Now they talk about $85 billion for public transportation, which is a lot more than we've been spending. But just taking the New York City Transit Authority, they need an emergency influx of $12 billion just in the next year. So that's, like an eighth or a seventh of the national. And they want $51.5 billion by 2024 for their capital budget, because they have neglected keeping that system up, and it's had a lot of problems. So you put just what New York City needs in terms of the national investment, and the national investment barely covers New York City. What about the rest of the country? And they had $80 billion for Amtrak and freight rails, and Amtrak had to put out a map right as soon as this came out, and it shows you around the country. They're mainly going to upgrade the routes they do have. They're going to add some, which is good. But when you look at that map and compare it to what they have in Europe, it's pretty sparse. So, this is not adequate to the need again. And transportation is the best sector, I think, in terms of what Biden has in his plan. When it comes to power, there's not a lot of commitment to investment. It's mainly a clean energy standard, which is technology neutral and requires a certain percentage of utility sales to be met by clean, zero or low carbon sources, such as renewables. They include nuclear energy and coal or gas fitted with carbon capture technology, which is not economical and still in development. And this is a very conservative idea. Lindsey Graham had a bill for this in 2010, and a conservative Democrat had a little bit better bill, Jeff Binghamton from New Mexico, in 2012. So that's the main thing. It's not public ownership and production and sale of clean power like we propose, like Bernie Sanders proposed. It's setting the standard and then having the utilities adapt to it, and they can use dirty energy like nukes and fossil fuels. And so they have $35 billion for climate research and development, but that includes carbon capture, includes quote unquote advanced nuclear, which is a catch-all phrase for small modular reactors and different cooling systems instead of water, molten salt, or high temperature gas or liquid metal. I mean, all this stuff is not new. It's not advanced. It has been tried in the nuclear era starting in the 50s, and it failed. This is a sales gimmick of the nuclear industry. It's not a serious proposal. And nuclear now costs more than most forms of solar and wind over the lifetime of producing the plant and then generating the electricity by 2 or 3 times. So why would you even talk about nuclear after Fukushima, when we have a fleet of nukes that are supposed to have been retired after 40 years, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or as I like to refer to it, the Nuclear Rubber Stamp Commission, has extended the lifetime on some of these plants to 60 years, some of them to 80 years, some have applied for 100 years. And radiation embrittles the metal components, which means they're more likely to fail and create a catastrophic accident. And of course, none of these so-called advanced nuclear forms get rid of the nuclear waste problem, where you've got to store for hundreds of thousands of years highly radioactive and dangerous waste. So it's uneconomical, it's dirty, and it's dangerous. Yet it's promoted throughout this document. And if you want to know more about that, the Union of Concerned Scientists came out with a study last month called "Advanced Isn't Always Better," referring to this so-called advanced nuclear. They're not safer, they're not more economical. They actually increase the risks of nuclear proliferation and terrorism. And of course, there's the waste problem. And we have to understand that nuclear has never been profitable. It's probably the most failed industrial enterprise in the modern era, because it always, the insurance industry wouldn't insure them because the accidents were so bad, it would break the insurance industry. So we have the Price-Anderson Act, where the federal government partially insures us against catastrophic accidents. They can't even fully insure us. So the only reason I can conceive of is that, Biden wants to favor big corporate donors in the nuclear industry like GE and Westinghouse. I can't find of any rational reason to do that. And, he wants to talk a lot about jobs. For every dollar invested in the green economy of solar, wind, rails, and retrofitting buildings, 17 jobs are created, compared to 5 jobs when that same $1 million is invested in fossil fuels or nuclear energy. So even from his jobs framework, it doesn't make any sense at all. So that's the power sector. And just to sum it up, they're counting on investor-owned utilities, as we call them IOUs, to make the transition through this clean energy standard, but allow them to call nuclear and fossil fuels that they can define as low carbon, or the carbon is captured, as part of the mix. And, it's hard to believe their goal in this case is to get to 100% clean energy by net zero emissions by 2035. Be careful of that word net zero, because what it means is we're going to capture the carbon or we're going to offset it. So we'll plant a tree, that would absorb carbon, and then you can pollute with carbon. And of course, we need those trees not just to offset emissions, we need them to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. Because like I said before, if 350 parts per million carbon dioxide is the safety zone or the limit, and we're at over 421 just a few days ago, we not only have to stop emissions, we got to draw it out of the atmosphere. That's what planting trees should be about, not about offsetting, fossil fuels we're still burning in 2035 or even 2050 when they want to get to 100%, what do they call it? Net zero carbon emissions across all sectors by 2050. And as you go through these sectors, you could see it in transportation by the 2035. You could see it in power, maybe, but not in the other sectors. Buildings is a big sector. It's 12% of the carbon footprint. And they have $213 billion to build and retrofit. They say 2 million affordable housing units in commercial buildings. And they're going to build 1 million new electrified housing units in 500,000 homes. And then they're going to add 40 billion to improve public housing. Well, let's put this in context. There are 120 million buildings in this country. And if you're going to retrofit a maximum of 2 million over 8 years, do the math. That's 60 times 8. That's like half a millennium to retrofit all the buildings in the country. This is not a serious climate program. They come up with maybe $200, $250 million in the housing, the building sector. In our Eco-Socials Green New Budget, we had 6.5 trillion because we want to not only retrofit the buildings we got, we want to build 25 million new units of good public housing as a climate program, because they'll be, clean energy powered, but also as a program to provide affordable housing to everybody, to realize that housing right in the Economic Bill of Rights, and also as a desegregation program. Public housing was used to increase segregation. It could also be used to desegregate us by race and class. European, what they call social housing, is a mix of not just poor people, but blue collar, middle income people and professionals. They all live in the same public housing or social housing developments. And that reduces the kind of segregation that creates concentrated and isolated poverty, which is a huge issue in this country. So they're not doing enough in the housing sector. And then the public housing, 40 billion for public housing. Come on. The New York City Housing Authority alone needs 68.5 billion through 2028 to fix their terrible problems with lead, mold, elevators, boilers, roofs. In the winter of 2017, 80% of night shift residents went for periods without heat. So it isn't just New York City where public housing has been neglected for the last 50 years. So that again is some money that will get some jobs to, people in the construction industry to do some repairs and upgrades, but it's not meeting the needs of public housing tenants, let alone the need for affordable housing. So as I said, we have a 10-year, $2.5 trillion investment to build 25 million units. That would cover the shortage of affordable housing, which the National Low Income Housing Coalition, a few years ago, they did what they call it, the housing gap study. And they found there were 7.5 million very low income people who couldn't find affordable housing and 400,000 homeless. That's probably got worse in the pandemic. And another statistic from that year is U.S. Department of Education. 1.5 million children experienced homelessness during the school year that year. So, the housing need now with, forget the number, it's billions in overdue rent. And the recent, COVID relief package had some money for that, but it's inadequate. And I don't know about where you live, but here in New York, they still haven't got that money to the tenants, and the deadlines are coming up. And we know in housing court here in Syracuse, they're evicting people now. So this is a huge crisis. And then in manufacturing, very little. There's a lot of talk about, supporting domestic semiconductor and medical supply chains and, federal government purchasing. There's $500 billion in annual federal purchasing to stimulate domestic manufacturing, particularly electric vehicles, the electric vehicle infrastructure. And they do mention heat pumps to replace gas and heating oil and propane in heating our homes, which is good. But they say nothing about technologies like cement, which is at least 5% of the world's carbon footprint, because it requires calcium carbonate. Calcium hardens the cement. The carbon evaporates into the atmosphere. And so it's a huge problem in terms of climate change. No discussion about transforming that industry to a form of cement that doesn't release carbon. And another example I like to use is steel manufacturing. It's mostly done by coke ovens. The industry itself is moving toward electric arc furnaces. But without public ownership and planning that we're talking about, those industries are going to wear out their coke ovens before they replace them with electric arc furnaces. And so what we do in the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal budget is go through key technologies we got to transform and talk about federal government building the machinery for these new industries. That's the machine tool industry, which is pretty much gone from this country. Those are the machines that make machines. And that needs to be rebuilt. Biden says nothing about that. And finally, agriculture, he says nothing. That's 10% of the carbon footprint, but it has enormous potential to draw carbon out of the atmosphere back into the biosphere by rebuilding soils with an organic regenerative agriculture system. The only thing it really touches on there is $10 billion for a civilian climate corps. This is token. This is, our budget, if I recall rightly, has $2 trillion over 10 years for, we call it, what Roosevelt called it, the Civilian Conservation Corps. That would be about afforestation and restoring habitat, and would operate around the world, not just in the United States, as part of a global Green New Deal. So, his 10 billion compared to our 200 billion, that's 1/20th to one a year. Well, his is 10 billion over 8 years. So he's about, and we're talking about he's about 1/100th of what we see as the need if we're going to reforest all these areas that are being destroyed. And the other thing he says nothing about is the international dimensions of this. The U.S. is basically consuming the biodiversity of the Amazon and the rainforests in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea and Malaysia. And, those wood products come to us, they come to China, they come to the rich countries to the north, and basically we're leaving behind palm oil plantations or temporary cattle grazing for hamburgers that depletes the soil until it's useless. And so that they call it the ecological debt. We talk about reparations, and this is called the climate debt. We need to invest in rebuilding those rainforests. And yes, it's a transfer of wealth from here to those countries, but it's also an investment in the fundamental habitability of the planet for all of us. So we all got a stake in that. So Biden is not up to the task. So I'll just wrap this up, and I went more than 15 or 20 minutes, but what can we do at this point? Well, we got to keep speaking up for a real Green New Deal. And, the Sunrise Movement, giving expression to this Green New Deal network. Tomorrow they have 65 demonstrations calling for a job guarantee, building the green economy. We should be out there if there's a demonstration in our community, lending our voice to that and continuing to do that kind of thing. We really got to oppose fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure. And Biden got a headline for a 60-day temporary ban on oil and gas leasing on public lands, which the right said was a fracking ban. It wasn't. That 60 days is up. That was January 30th. It was up last week. I haven't been able to find out if he's extended it or what, or it's just up. But we have won some battles on fracking. Delaware River Basin, which covers 4 states in the mid-Atlantic, banned fracking in that river basin. There's a bill in California. This is probably the key fracking ban fight, the frontline fight right now, to ban fracking there by 2027. And this is coming from the Democrats, Chevron and those oil companies and the gas companies are going to fight them like hell. We need to get behind that bill. And then there are pipelines. We got Enbridge Line 6 stopped, but now, and we got the Keystone XL stopped, but there's still the Dakota Access Pipeline. There's Enbridge Line 3. There's the Mountain Valley Pipeline in the Mid-Atlantic. There's the Pacific Connector Pipeline. These are fights that we've got to engage and we can win. And then we got gas-fired power plants going up all over the country, which is what the pipelines are for. We have the Dance Camera plant and a new, I think it's a 500 megawatt plant they want to build in Astoria, Queens. So we got our fights here in New York, and I'm sure around the country you have them. And then finally, I think we got to fight back against this proposal to go with more nukes. Obama administration subsidized nukes in South Carolina and Georgia. And because of cost overruns and construction delays, the nukes in South Carolina, they had to give them up. They're only still going in Georgia because Brian Kemp stole the governorship from Stacey Abrams a couple years ago, and he's a creature of Georgia Power and the Southern Company. But that's a fight right there. They're still pouring money down that waste hole. So there are particular fights we can win, and we can keep speaking up for the real Green New Deal. And so, sorry I took longer than I'd planned, but hey.
Why are you apologizing? First off, this is like your meat and bread. This is what you're known for. And everything that you broke down, I mean, I can't speak for all of the folks who are sitting in the chat, except that troll who we're ignoring. But all of the other folks that are supposed to be here that are sitting in the chat, we got something for this. I mean, we got a lot from this. This was an important discussion because there's no way I will spend a slog through all of that reading and all of that density. And you just did like a people's breakdown. So don't ever apologize for doing what this is your live stream to do. This is your space. Take it, and we appreciate you.
Okay, I just want to make sure there's time to answer questions. So
oops, my bad. I went on. Yeah, my bad. I went on mute. Tiffany McNeely. Hey, boo. I might have missed it last week, But what do you have to say about Buttigieg plan on tax per mile?
Yeah, I haven't really thought much about it. I did hear a little bit about it. So basically, they, I guess, get some kind of, you have to report what your odometer says, how many miles you traveled, and then pay a tax on that. That is a disincentive to use a personal car and move you toward public transportation. I would have to look at the amount of the tax, study whether it really was an incentive. The problem is a lot of people don't have a choice. They got to commute to work or to school. I mean, I live in inner city Syracuse. All the grocery stores are in the suburbs. And I don't want to eat corner food store. You know, it's basically chicken wings, potato chips, and soda. So it's something I have to think about. I think, you know, user fees have their place. I just don't know if it's what we should be doing right now, rather than putting a lot more money into public transportation and making it convenient and more economical for people to use instead of personal vehicles.
Hey, Trey. Trey Legal is asking, did y'all already talk about how much money? And it was dope because when his question popped up, you were talking about, you made a mention of the electric cars. Did y'all already talk about how much money the electrical car manufacturers are getting?
Yeah, I did give the number. I think it was 174 billion, and Biden's plan is for 8 years. Yeah, 174 billion for the EV chargers, the electric vehicle charging stations. And it's not a detailed budget. If you go to Investopedia, they did the best breakdown of what's in there. And I did mention that, yeah, this is a big subsidy to the auto industry. I mean, in our plan, the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal budget, we would, and if the auto industry didn't cooperate in our planning, we would, you know, take them over like we did during World War II, when we had to transform them from producing cars to producing weapons and tanks and jeeps. So, and also as public enterprises, we can operate at cost for public benefit instead of cost plus profit for investors. And we should have done that after the 2008 crisis, when I guess it was Chrysler and GE, you know, the federal government bailed them out, had the stock, could have, you know, taken over the management, and they refused to do so. And when those industries got back on their feet with the subsidies, we sold the stock.
Hey, Shomara. We can't leave behind coal mining communities in West Virginia, and you have addressed this before, Howie.
Yeah, as part of our Eco-Socialist Green New Deal, we have a just transition program so that everybody who's displaced by this green economy reconstruction program, which would include coal miners and their communities, it would include, you know, people working at coke oven steel factories while we build electric arc furnace factories. Those people would all be guaranteed current wages and benefits for up to 5 years until they find comparable work. We think people will be able to find it very quickly between the amount of jobs this program creates and the job guarantee, which would function the way we look at it, like the Works Progress Administration did, where most of the jobs are planned locally, local infrastructure or public works, as well as social infrastructure, social services. And those jobs are on the shelf. And if you're unemployed and can't get a job in the private sector, you go to the employment office instead of the unemployment office and say you want your job. And they match your skills to the jobs available, maybe even offer job training if they need to move people like you into jobs where there's a need. And so now in terms of what needs to be done in West Virginia, we should be paying those people to repair the damages that coal mining has done. Mountaintop removal, open mines leave a lot of toxic and a lot of natural gas seeping out of the mines. Those have to be sealed up because methane is 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide over the first 20 years it's in the atmosphere. It breaks down faster than carbon dioxide, but it makes an immediate, rapid, and extreme impact on global warming. So there's plenty of work that needs to be done in those communities. And then developing sustainable industries, given the environmental resources available in West Virginia, that should be part of public planning. And, we talk about having a public banking with the technical expertise to do business planning, get businesses started, hire the workers, train them, not just to do the jobs, but to manage the company, or at least operate as a co-op where the workers elect a board that hires the managers. That needs technical support. It needs financing. So that's the kind of support we should give. And, I'll just say on the just transition, when Biden said we're not doing the Keystone XL, he didn't say what's going to happen to those workers. A lot of them were Teamsters. I heard about it from Teamsters. And I heard in the media, everybody from Trump to Trump, head of the AFL-CIO, what's going to happen to those workers? There was no just transition program in place. So when you shut down a pipeline people are working on, you're not helping those people make the transition to comparable work. That needs to be part of it, or industry will be able to mobilize those kind of workers against a Green New Deal and dealing with climate. Because the way it's framed from their point of view is my job versus poverty. And, climate change, I can't be a sacrifice lamb for dealing with climate change. I need a job. So that's what the just transition does. It answers that question for those kind of folks. And it originated out of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, which no longer exists as an independent union. It merged into the paper workers and now the steel workers. But back in the 70s and 80s, Tony Mazzocchi, who was a visionary labor leader, got to talking with his people who were in the dirtiest industries, oil, nukes, chemicals, and they knew it was killing them. They knew it was dangerous, but they didn't want to give up their jobs without a transition to better work. So back then it was called the Superfund for Workers. We had a Superfund for corporations that couldn't pay for the cleanup, public funding. We needed a Superfund for workers, and we still do. That's what we call the just transition today.
Hey, Gene. Gene is asking, how should we revamp agriculture to reduce environmental damage? And I think this also ties with the question that Trey asked also in the chat about the linkage between the way that animal agriculture, large-scale animal agriculture, is currently being done and its detrimental impact on the environment as well. So I think, reading this question made me think of that. I had seen that one in the chat as well.
Well, what we need to do is go back to organic agriculture, sometimes called regenerative agriculture, which involves, instead of big monocultural fields and animal factory farms, involves diversified, smaller scale agriculture. We get corporations out of it. We get the Wall Street investors from the private equity firms, which are buying into agriculture and turning most of the remaining farmers into tenant farmers, so that the farmer owns the land they work. We need to subsidize the transition to organic agriculture and also provide technical assistance. We got to rapidly phase out pesticides, which are destroying insect populations. We're having an insect population collapse, which is essential to our ecosystems and particularly agriculture. So all that has to go together. And then we need to make sure the farmers who are on the land have a living income. So we propose parity pricing, which means basically your costs will be covered by the prices of commodities, which would be all commodities, not just the big grains and some of the meats, but all fruits and vegetables, all dairy products, so that all those products have parity pricing, and that parity floor goes up or down with the cost of production. We also need supply management so farmers aren't caught selling into a glut and getting undersold. And then we need a new homesteading program, because if we go to this diversified, smaller scale family farming or small cooperative farming, we're going to need about 1 million more farmers. And people say, well, the people that are farming now, their children don't want to farm. Well, we got a whole group of farmers that came up here because of what U.S. foreign policy did in Mexico and Central America. The immigrants from those countries, their dream is to be farmers here. And right now they're farm workers, underpaid. If they're undocumented, maybe getting their wages stolen. Those are people that would love to become our new farmers. So there's a lot we can do with an agricultural program that moves us toward organic agriculture. And then, animals, when you have these big factory farms, the concentrated animal feed operations, you get concentrated crap, which is runoff. It pollutes the rivers. And the animals, the way they're treated in those things is inhumane, shouldn't happen. I know some people want to go completely vegan, but there are a lot of farmers, and if you understand agroecology, animals are part of the ecosystem, and so they have a role on farms, even if you're not eating them. They are, fertilizing the fields and consuming the waste, so they have a role to play too.
Yeah. The boss and I just discussed this question. Shane Overdeer. The environment is way more important to civilization than some miners being out of work a few weeks. This is not an either or. It is a both and. We need to take care of the environment, and we also need to take care of people. And what you just said, Howie, about the just transition, looking at this question, at least where I'm saying, where I'm standing looking at this question, this is what the just transition answers. What do you think?
Well, the environment is way more important than any of us. But if we're going to win politically, we can't alienate people that ought to be on our side. So even if you got no sense of humanity for your fellow workers, it's in your interest to get them on your side so we can take the environmental actions we need.
That's that. I don't think you could have done better than that. That was pretty savage. Hey, Gene. I heard on Science Friday that feeding seaweed to cows reduces the amount of methane they produce. But I'm not sure if that's a natural food for cows. That's because I don't believe it is. I ain't never heard of cows eating seaweed. And I'm from Wisconsin. I think I would know. I'm just saying.
Yeah, it's not like cows go swimming out in the ocean for that seaweed they crave. On the other hand, they do eat it, and it produces less, fewer farts. And so, there may be a role for that. I think, you have to have a sustainable harvest of the seaweed. I'm not a seaweed expert, but I hear the seaweed off the coast of California has been having a hard time because of warming waters and other environmental problems, and invading species or lack of, I forget the ecological dynamics of that, but I think it's something worth looking at. And if there's a sustainable way to harvest the seaweed and feed it to cows, let's do it, because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas.
Hey, Z. Hey, boo. How do we combat planned obsolescence on consumer products, man?
Yeah.
Capitalism.
That's an important question. And I think what we do is with social ownership and economic planning, we can choose to have, phones that last more than to the time when they want to sell you the latest model. Same thing with cars. Same thing with all kinds of consumer products. We can also mandate that the packaging and the product itself have to be taken back by the manufacturer. So they have to design ways of recycling that waste. But the main thing is we should be producing goods that last a long time. And while it will reduce the GDP, which is based on the amount of sales, you're selling stuff less, but we'll increase our wealth because we'll have goods that we can use over a longer period of time. So I think, economic planning within an eco-socialist framework is the only way we're going to do that. We're not going to scold the corporations that are seeking profits into selling fewer goods, because planned obsolescence is their strategy to sell you more stuff. So we need a different system to tackle that problem.
And I think also we have to look at our culture. And I'm not going to blame the culture, because at the end of the day, it is capitalism that tells people you need to consume your phone. Yeah, it still works, but you need the better one. You need to. So yeah, I was about to do that whole, it's on us to do this, but it's really not on us. This is the way capitalism works, to tell us to keep buying things that, and obsolescence is built into things to keep you buying them. So I hate it here. No, okay. Hey, Trey. And Howie actually did touch on this. I saw your question in the chat. Can we also talk about the environmental cost of never-ending war, Lord? Howie?
Yeah. Wars are environmental disasters. Whether you're talking about Agent Orange in Vietnam or depleted uranium in the Middle East, the people left behind, our own members of the armed forces, got a lot of disease from being exposed. But the people who live there are still suffering from that pollution. So that's one problem. Another is just the enormous waste of resources. And I'm not just talking about, steel and, all the other stuff that goes into keeping a military together. I'm talking about the brain power. We have people with administration or managerial skills, technical and scientific and engineering skills, figuring out how to maintain a system designed to kill people. They could be putting their knowledge and expertise to work designing a green economy, the specific components of it. The Army Corps of Engineers, we could use them for a lot of the habitat restoration we need to do, or the rail construction we need to do. But right now, they do a lot of stuff domestically in terms of infrastructure. But when we're at war, they make it easier for the military machine to move around. So the main, I think, environmental cost is really the waste of brain power that should be going into solving this climate problem and the other environmental problems, like the plastic crisis.
We are getting the cane from the boss. So what are the thoughts that you want to lead the people with?
Well, I regret I talked so long that we didn't get time to answer more questions.
If you say that one more time, I swear on everything, I'm gonna flip.
Well, I do want to answer people's questions, but there'll be more time. We do this every week. So if you have questions we didn't answer, show up next Tuesday and be happy to answer them. My closing thought is I laid out a pretty bleak picture in terms of what Biden proposes, but I hope people take away the optimistic side. We can beat these people. We're beating them on these different fights around pipelines. We have beat them. We're going to have more around fracking, around stopping these gas-fired power plants. And as we do that and we raise the demand for a real Green New Deal, it's going to reverberate. I mean, if we hadn't been making sense in the 2010s as the Green Party calling for a Green New Deal, it wouldn't have been picked up by, the big nonprofits like Sunrise and the Democratic politicians like AOC. Now it's part of the discussion. And our role, all of us can play a role in this, is to make sure they don't water it down and call defeats victories. I mean, I just read an op-ed by somebody who ought to know better, praising Biden's plan. And this is somebody I've known for like 50 years. He ought to know better. But, we gotta tell it like it is, but not, be too discouraged, because I think we're winning in terms of winning public opinion. A decade ago, the way the corporate media was dealing with the climate issue, well, on the one hand, people say it's a hoax, like Trump did. On the other hand, people say it's for real, like the scientists did. But it was like, in public opinion, really wasn't that worried about it. But as we get these extreme weather events and, rapid, massive wildfires, people are beginning to say, maybe there's something to it. And public opinion has switched. I mean, even the Green New Deal, the public polling on that, majority of Republicans want one. We've won the ideological battle. Now we got to translate that into political will. So while Biden's plan is nothing to celebrate, the fact that he even has a plan, where was the plan from the previous administrations? You go back to that Kyoto agreement in '92, and Al Gore, the supposedly big environmentalist, he was out there in Kyoto trying to water it down. And then the Kyoto agreement was never brought by Clinton and Gore to the U.S. Senate. Now, they would say politically because they couldn't get it passed. Well, why the hell didn't they fight for it? They weren't fighting for the climate issue. And then, Bush was AWOL. Obama was not taking leadership. Let's put it that way. I mean, they had people like John Kerry negotiating, who now is on the National Security Council, as if the climate issue is, they call it a security threat. And they're not talking about environmental destruction undermining our economy. They're talking about, we got to have more detention camps for climate refugees. This comes from World War Zero, the group that Kerry was part of. When he got appointed, they issued a statement saying, great, Kerry's on the National Security Council as a climate czar, and here's what we need: more detention camps for climate refugees, more military presence in the South China Sea, competing with China for that oil and gas, and in the Arctic Ocean, competing with the Russians for that oil and gas. And, the Russians, I mean, what could go wrong with this? They put out one of 7 planned barges with 2 nuclear power plants on them to power oil and gas drilling in the Arctic Ocean. I mean, instead of, saber rattling and warmongering, we got to sit down. You remember a week ago or so, Biden said, he was asked by George Stephanopoulos, is Putin a killer? And Biden, instead of like dodging the question and not creating an international thing, said yes. So Putin responds by saying, I want to have an online discussion with Biden, like it's some damn reality show. And he does his own videos. These guys are performing for their domestic political audiences and the international community, instead of talking to each other about this serious problem of climate change and the other serious problem of the new nuclear arms race. So that's another thing. We gotta stop these politicians from, performing for us and just kick their butts and tell them to get in a room and start figuring things out.
The image that just flashed through my head is not the image that I want to share with folks about how to make that happen. I'm leaving that alone. Yeah, I mean, my just thinking, first off, thank you, Howie, for that breakdown that you keep apologizing for, but you really took that piece by piece and gave folks something that when, you know, folks from the Democrat side and people who want to believe that this administration is actually going to do something radically different come with their nonsense. You gave people something that they can point to and say, no, we have a breakdown of what exactly is in this so-called plan, and it's bull. Your plan's trash. Sorry. And this is what we've given them something to compare it to. So just thinking, is like folks in the chat were saying, there's reasons for hope. I mean, I'm an Eeyore, but we keep fighting. We keep pushing. I mean, we all have a stake in the health of this planet, and she deserves better than what she's been getting. And, just thinking of indigenous activists who, put the teeth in direct action. These miners came in and they beat them down, tied them to their equipment, and stripped them. So yeah, I was like, that's how you do that. But yeah, we keep fighting, and don't let them water down. We have a plan. We presented a plan. There is a budget to our plan. There's nothing mystical about this. And it's being proven that programs like Medicare for All pay for themselves. This is not, something that's that's a pull on the public purse. This is a program that people need, people want, people support, and it pays for itself. Everything that we've proposed pays for itself. So we're not wrong. So in the middle of all of this stuff that's happening, I understand, Patricia, I'm not the most optimistic person in the world, but I have to dig it up. We have to keep going, because if we don't, they win. And I'm too spiteful to give these people that. So keep, those of you who are I know here in South Carolina, they have made then we're the change, honey. We are the change, sweetheart. We are the change. We are the change. They're not going to change until we force them to change. We are the change. Here in South Carolina, the vaccine has been, from what I understand, and correct me on that, Geda and Diana, if I'm wrong, but here in South Carolina, they've made the vaccine available to anybody over 16. So anybody who wants it can get it. Those of, I'm hoping that if it's become available to y'all where you are, and it is something that you want to take and you can take, I hope that you are able to get it, and keep yourself healthy. Continue masking up, taking your precautions, doing all of the internal stuff that you've been doing to stay healthy, because we need you. Take your elderberry sip, and we'll see you next week. Sending y'all big love.
Yeah, let me just add that I'm writing up what I talked about today, so that should be on our website soon, and try to get it published somewhere, and so we'll get the word out.